Tarrant County Master Gardener Association has partnered with the Tarrant Regional Water District to encourage water conservation. TRWD maintains 4 area lakes and pipelines needed to provide surface water to local water treatment plants so they can clean that water to meet drinking standards for our communities. There are currently 2.3 million people living in Tarrant County, and this is expected to double over the next 50 years. At SaveTarrantWater.com, you can sign up for free weekly watering advice custom to your location. There's also an event calendar where you can find information about future classes and workshops. So be sure and check out SaveTarrantWater.com to sign up for their free services.
For anyone who was here last week and you came back, welcome back. And I hope that you enjoy this program as well. And if you're new tonight, when we get the recording up, I hope you, for the last week, I hope you go back and check that out. And then we have one more week, and next week we'll be talking about trees, shrubs, and vines, ground covers, grasses. So for this evening, we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is perennials, and we're going to talk about for sun and shade. But before that, we have a couple things to consider. So soil prep. Remember last week I talked about, planting that 50-cent plant in a $5 hole. So you want to make sure that your soil is prepped before you plant. So go to that soiltesting.tamu.edu and get the kit to or the information to get your soil tested so you know what you're dealing with. And then we talked about this last time, adding 3 inches of compost to prep your bed because it adds nutrients and improves your drainage. And then if you have heavy clay soils, we talked about the expanded shale. Shale rock that's superheated and it's broken up into little gravel, and they just sell it by the bag. Usually it's about a 40-pound bag, and any garden center will sell that. Next, plant selection. So lots of things to consider: bloom color, what time of the year it blooms, or maybe you don't want a lot of summer blooming things, but you're at your home in our area in the spring and the fall, and so you want most of your blooming things to be at those times that you're there to enjoy it. So just think about that. Or having a succession bloom in your garden, so you've got something blooming all 4 seasons. Then you need to consider the height of the perennial that you're wanting to plant, and different textures. We talked about that last time too. And then the shape of the plant, because you want to contrast shapes and textures. And then whether you want a fragrant perennial, maybe something by a seeding area, and then consider whether you want evergreen or deciduous. And then for sure consider that mature size, because we have perennials that will grow pushing 6 feet tall, and some that are just hug the ground as a little ground cover. So just consider that when you're placing your perennials. And then, of course, native and adapted plants, because native is from this area and they do well, and adapted are plants that aren't necessarily from this area, but they do well in our climate. So we are in zone 8, probably maybe a little bit 7B if you're farther north, and all of 8 in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Okay, light requirements. We talked a lot about this last time. You do that sun chart. How I mentioned, make a chart that says align 7 a.m., 8, 9, 10, all the way to 7 p.m. and watch the area that you want to landscape. Make a note whether it's sun or shade, and at the end of a few weeks of time, you're going to have all those slots filled in, maybe even within just a week. And then you're going to know whether you've got 6+ hours of sun, or whether you're in a dappled shade area, for instance. So and then you can tailor the plant material to what your light requirements are. And then mulching, I mentioned this last time, non-negotiable. You've got to mulch. It helps conserve moisture. It helps prevent erosion. It cuts down on the weeds. It's not foolproof, but it will help you. It protects the roots of your plants. And then it continues to break down and continues to build that soil. So mulch is just compost in the making. So then watering, we recommend that you water less frequently, but deeper when you do water. It's best to apply about 1 inch per week. There are little rain gauges that you can put out and run your sprinkler system to determine how much water is getting put out in an area. so that you can increase that time or back off on it a little bit. You can also just use little like tuna cans or cat food cans or something like that to measure how much water you're putting out when you're running a zone. And then we recommend watering early morning, not at night, because watering at night promotes fungal issues. I use the phrase dark plus wet equals fungus. So when you're watering, early morning, it's right before the sun comes up, and then the sun will burn the water off of that foliage and it will be dry. And so then you don't have as many fungal problems. Follow your city's water restrictions. Pretty much in Tarrant County, we are restricted to twice a week during the hours after 6 p.m., but you have to be done running your system before 10. Now, if you are watering with a hose, there's not restrictions on that, or if you have a well. Cycle and soak is what I recommend. So that's watering your system. If you have spray heads, water for, instead of, for instance, watering for 30 minutes straight, do it 3 times at 10 minutes, 10, 10, 10, just as an example. So you run your whole system, and then you run it again, and then you run it again, and it gets time. I have, for instance, 12 zones in my landscape. So it takes an hour and a half to run all of those zones. And so then I will start it over in 2 hours. And so it has an hour and a half to run. Not every zone running that long. Some zones run 6 minutes, some zones run 15 minutes. It just depends on whether it's a spray head or a rotor, whether it's in sun or shade. So there's not one size fits all on watering. You just have to tailor it to the plant material. And if you're using drip irrigation, you do need to run it a little bit longer so that it has time to soak in. And then if you're on a slope, that makes a difference too. Maintenance, you need to consider that. We've always got a weed, we've always got a deadhead. Perennials are a low maintenance and easy in that you only plant them once, but they do need tending too. So deadheading just means removing spent blooms, and they will continue blooming longer the more that you cut those spent blooms off, because the energy you want to going to form new blooms and not setting seeds. So when you cut those spent blooms off, you're stopping it forming seeds, and then it puts that energy back into making blooms. And then we talked about this last time too, that there's 3 times a year that you will do pruning. And the first time is after that first freeze, or the last time is after that first freeze in November. And then there's some perennials you may want to leave if they've got seed heads for birds, or you may want to leave those through the winter and then cut them in February right before spring growth. And then we have to dig and divide, because perennials, as I'm going to mention in just a second, first year they sleep, then they creep, and then they leap. And so after that, then you need to dig and divide and share them with friends. So yeah, this is what I'm talking about. That first year they're sleeping, they're forming their roots. The next year they're creeping, where the tops are starting to grow, they're getting more established. And by that 3rd year, they're leaping, where they are really expanding and coming into their own. So after that, 3rd year of leap year, they usually leap every year after that. So you kind of have to rein them in and dig and divide and share them with friends. Okay. If someone collects a lot of plants, does that make them a horticulturist? Yes, I am a horticulturist. I have a lot of plants. This is a picture of my front yard. And so the first section we're going to go through on perennials is perennials for sun. So Salvia is a huge category, but excellent plants for our area. They love hot and dry. So I'm going to go through each of these, but just Salvia farinaceae is up in the upper left with the blue, and the Monarch, major Monarch and Pollinator Attractor. And then on the right side, we've got the Salvia gregii is the pink, and the Leucantha is the purple. And then down in the lower left, we've got Salvia darcii. So Salvia gregii is one of my favorite perennials. It's almost shrub-like. My tip on this plant, though, is if you will cut it down to 6 inches every mid-February. Now, I understand this year we had the freeze, but anytime, mid to late February, even into really early March, if you will take this plant and just chop it down to 6 inches, even if it grows 3 feet tall and wide, cut it down to 6 inches. And that keeps it from getting woody and rangy, and it puts on all new growth and blooms so much better. And then during the growing season, if it, or after it has a flush of blooms, if you will just give it a haircut, and what I mean by that is maybe shearing off about 3 inches of the plant, that will give it another flush of growth to keep blooming. Salvia farinaceae, or mealy cup sage. One of my favorite varieties is Henry Dulberg salvia. And then the white bloomer that's in this picture is Augusta Dulberg. It's just a tall, blue or white blooming perennial that pollinators love. And my tip on this plant is whenever it gets what I call leggy, so in this picture, it's showing how all the leaves are off the bottom and you can see all the stems. That just means it's time to chop it to the ground. And I always tell people, if you ever look at your Henry Dulberg and go, that looks kind of crummy, it just means it's time to chop it to the ground. I think in England, they call it the Chelsea chop. Just chop it down. You don't have to measure, how far you're chopping it down, just somewhere above the ground, a couple inches. Just take your shears. You can use a hedge trimmer, whatever you want. Chop it down. And in about 3 weeks, it will be back full and lush and blooming again. So don't be afraid to chop it down. And I will do it a couple times during the growing season. And it's time to do mine right now. Here's another kind of salvia, Salvia nemorosa or Salvia superba. Maynite is a very common one. Snow Hill is a white blooming variety. There's East Friesland, there's Blue Hill. There's a new mauve colored one called, I think, Rose Marble maybe, but they're all excellent. And this is one that if you will keep deadheading it, it will bloom all the more. And sometimes when I have more that needs to be deadheaded than our new blooms, I just, again, chop it to the ground and it will come right back out nice and clean and bloom its head off again. So Salvia leucantha is Mexican bush sage. This is a quite large perennial. It will grow 3 to 4 feet tall and wide. And this one blooms in the fall, usually about October time frame, it will start blooming. And so this is one, if you will cut this down by half before July, it will form a thicker growth and be able to support the blooms. But it's a real velvety bloom on it, and some have the purple and white on the bloom, and some are all just purple. But Monarch attractor like crazy. All right, this is a low-growing perennial called Phlox subulata. Or creeping phlox. It just grows maybe 3 inches tall, but then forms like this little carpet of blooms. And it only blooms early spring, but profuse bloomer in about the March time frame. And then when it's finished blooming, you just have an evergreen, low-growing kind of carpet of evergreen. This is Bass Pink Dianthus. Again, an early spring bloomer about that March time frame. These blooms are so fragrant. There are other varieties of this dianthus. This is a perennial dianthus. There are annual dianthus or biennial dianthus as well, but this is the true perennial. And when it's done blooming, then down in the lower picture there, you're going to see what the foliage looks like. And so it will stay evergreen. But it's just that nice little mound of kind of grayish green foliage when it's done blooming. So you'll go ahead and cut all the blooms off, and then you'll just have that foliage for the rest of the season. All right, Callilophus or sundrops is the common name. This is obviously yellow bloomer, just forms a mound that's about 1 foot tall and maybe 2 feet wide. Its greatest bloom time is in the spring, in that March, April time frame. It'll bloom sporadically through the summer, but its main bloom time is early spring. This is a tough perennial. If you give it too much water, it's gonna die. So it loves hot and dry. This is Oxeye daisy. This is an early spring bloomer, again in that March, April time frame. When it's done blooming, cut the whole plant to the ground, and then it will have kind of a rosette of green growth at the bottom, but it won't bloom again that year. But if you want to extend the daisy bloom time, then I recommend planting Shasta daisy. Because you get the same look, but it will bloom into the May and June timeframe. Mine are blooming right now. I have a variety called Becky Shasta daisy, but there are other varieties. But you have that classic white daisy look. So if you have oxeye planted and you also have Shasta, you will have a longer bloom time of a daisy. Bee balm. This is it'll bloom. Mine is blooming right now in my garden, so I would say the late May into June time frame it will bloom. Again, a pollinator attractor. It just has these little puff balls at the top of the stems. There's red ones. I don't know what variety this is, but there's a purple one. Anyway, after it's done blooming, I just cut it to the ground. And then I have other perennials that come up. Like I grow this in the same bed that I grow Turk's cap. So then the Turk's cap, since it's a fall bloomer, will grow up and kind of cover up the growth of this stays down at the ground. This does kind of spread readily. So put it in, be sure to keep it in bounds. And I always tell people that with any perennial, set your boundary. You say to your plant, you can grow in this space right here. And when it starts growing, starts leaping beyond that space, rein it in and just keep it under control. All right, this is Nepeta or catmint, the low growing lavender blooms in the foreground there, and that's Salvia greggii behind it. So I love that combination. This is the plant that I use instead of lavender because lavender needs excellent drainage and doesn't like our humidity. It's a Mediterranean plant, so it just is not long lived here. But catmint does very well here. It too needs good draining soil, but not quite as finicky as lavender. Now, anyone who's growing catmint this year is probably struggling because of all the rain that we had. But if you will just cut it back, it should put out some new growth. It may or may not bloom again this year, but at least it will look better because it does look a little ratty right now from all of the rain that we've had. That's the thing with our sun-loving, drought-tolerant perennials. They are challenged when we get these unusually wet springs. Purple coneflower. Everybody knows this plant. Yeah, it'll grow. There's lots of varieties of this too. This is just your standard purple coneflower. It's actually pink, but it'll grow about 2.5 to 3 feet tall. I do have a problem with this plant sometimes in my garden. It gets a virus called Aster's yellow or Aster yellows. I can never remember where the S goes, but it is a virus that will, the plant will not form any petals and the cone will be deformed. So if you see that on your plant where you have this very bizarre looking bloom or start of a bloom forming, there's no cure for it. It's spread by leaf hoppers. You have to dig that plant out and get rid of it. So just watch for that. It's very obvious if it has a problem. Summer phlox, Phlox paniculata. We had just talked about Phlox subulata, which is the low-growing creeping phlox. This is the tall summer phlox. I have pictured here John Fanick, and then there's another variety, Victoria. There's several varieties. Victoria and John Fanick are actually Texas superstars. So if you go to their website, you can read about those plants. I have a variety that I don't know the name of. It's kind of that lavendery pink look. Swallowtail butterflies love this plant. It's so fragrant. It can have a problem with powdery mildew on these, rainy springs that we've had. So you can treat that with neem or any fungicide, but you have to do repeat applications of that. Once you see the white powdery look on the leaves, you have to start treating right away. And it won't fix the leaves that already have it. It will just prevent it from spreading to the leaves up higher. Another fix for that is you can just cut the whole plant to the ground, and then now that it's hotter and drier, it'll grow back again. It'll bloom a little bit later, but hopefully won't have the fungal issues. Sometimes you have to thin this plant out. It needs good airflow so that it will help it to not get the fungal issues. Black-eyed Susans or Rudbeckia. The two most common varieties that I see are Gold Sturm and Triloba. Triloba, there's 3 lobes on the leaf, which is hence the name. It's got a smaller bloom. It grows a little bit taller, but they're both great plants. Goldsturm has a little bit bigger bloom. I do find that this plant kind of prefers a little afternoon shade. So if you can give this a little bit of protection in the afternoon, morning sun, afternoon shade, it's a little bit happier, I found. Daylilies. I used to not be a big daylily fan, but there are, I don't know, 500,000 varieties of them. I'm not exaggerating. But you know, everybody's got a friend who's got a daylily that, you know, you can get a start of. But there's a couple fun places that you can go to, like Big Chicken Daylily Farm down in, I think it's Edam. It's a couple hours from the Metroplex, southeast of here. So it's a really fun place. You go down there and you know, several times during the season, and you can pick the daylily that you want. They will dig it right there, and you can come home with your daylily. But there are early blooming daylilies which bloom about that May time frame, late May. There are mid-season bloomers that are going to bloom about in June, and then there are late season that are going to bloom later in June, maybe even into early July. So you can have, and there are tall varieties, there are short varieties, there are so many varieties of daylilies, so you can find one that you like, I'm sure. Irises. Now, these are just a very short bloom time in the spring. But there are a bazillion different varieties of irises as well. I also have a roof iris variety that actually handles a little bit of shade, does better in a protected area, whereas bearded iris are going to prefer a full sun area and really good drainage on iris. They don't even like to be mulched because their rhizome can rot. So they like really, really good draining soil. But then after they're done blooming, you can cut that bloom stalk, and then you've got some nice foliage for the rest of the season. So I enjoy that spiky foliage that it gives. All right, Society Garlic, it's kind of a grassy look, and then it gets this lavender bloom on it. One thing I want to tell you about this plant is when it freezes in the fall, for some reason, the foliage, the frozen foliage smells like a skunk. So if you grow this plant and, you know, after a freeze and you go out into your garden and you think you've had a skunk, it's probably just the Society Garlic, and all you need to do is cut it to the ground and you know, discard or put the clippings in the compost pile, and the smell will go away. There's just something about that frozen foliage that it smells that way, but it doesn't last long. It's a great plant. It will bloom all summer long. Heliotrope. This is the perennial variety of heliotrope called Azure Skies. It's got a very light lavender bloom on it. Some of you may be familiar with verbena, like Homestead Purple Verbena. I don't have long-term success with verbena for some reason. I don't know what it is, but it'll last a couple years and then it just kind of goes away. But heliotrope, this variety in particular, I have had for years. And it is a little hard to find, but you know, ask at the nursery where you go if they can get this plant in. It's deciduous, so it does, you know, die back in the wintertime or go dormant in the wintertime. I always have to tell my clients, you know, you need to learn the new D word, which is dormant. It's not dead. It just went dormant for the winter, so it will come back. But whereas verbena is evergreen, heliotrope is deciduous, so it will go dormant in the wintertime, but then it comes back faithfully every spring, and the bees love this plant. It's very low growing. It will grow about at least 2 to 3 feet wide, but it only grows maybe 8 inches tall. Pink skullcap is a great heat-loving, sun-loving perennial that we have. It'll only grow about a foot tall, and 1 gallon plant will probably reach up to 2 to maybe even 3 feet wide. It will bloom all summer long with these tiny little pink blooms on it, and it is evergreen. This plant I have only had to replace maybe once in my 23 years in this yard, but it survived our freeze this year. We had a freeze several years back and it didn't survive. I don't know what happened to it, but this year when we had -2, it sailed on through. So haven't had any issues with it. This is gray creeping germander. It's a little difficult to find as well. I know Steagles down in Fort Worth carries this plant. Again, just a ground hugging, drought tolerant plant that gets these tiny little lavender blooms on it. Just a note, any perennial that has gray foliage is usually super drought tolerant. So when we go through this program, notice the gray foliaged plants, and they need excellent drainage and tend to be more drought tolerant. So anyway, this is a great little creeping plant that, again, the pollinators love. Very well behaved, does not take over, just stays in a nice little low mound. Four-nerve daisy, another heat-loving, drought-tolerant perennial for our area. This one will bloom almost 12 months out of the year. It will grow, the foliage will grow about 6 inches tall or so, and it's evergreen. And then the blooms, these dainty little blooms, will stand up another 6 inches above that. And again, just blooms its head off all summer, and you will sporadically, even a mild winter, have blooms through the winter. Do not give this plant too much water or it will rot. Needs excellent drainage. Santolina, another one. Notice the gray foliage. Do not give this plant too much water. It will die almost overnight. This plant does get a yellow bloom on it. I need to find a picture of a yellow bloom. I never let mine bloom. I always cut it back in February because it's got a yellow bloom on it, and there's something about, I don't know, yellow and gray that I don't really care for together. Although in this picture, it's right by my Zexmania, so there's yellow and gray. But this has got actually kind of a cool button-like yellow bloom on it. So you may like that. And there's also a green variety of Santolina. Again, both of them are extremely drought tolerant. I have had this plant die very quickly in a wet spring that we've had a few years ago. But this spot where I have it, it gets really, really good drainage in a kind of a sandier soil, so it's very happy there. This is another one. Don't give it too much water. This one, think desert. This is a Blackfoot daisy. It will bloom its head off all summer long with fragrant blooms. Oh, I love this plant. But yeah, it needs super good drainage. It will grow upwards of 4 feet wide. It only grows about 1 foot tall, but it will just be a huge mound of blooms. So if you've got a spot where you need something fragrant and it is blasting sun all day long, this is your plant. The only problem I have had with it, it can be a little bit cold tender. So if we have a winter like we just had, and maybe not even that severe, it might not come back. But this is one that I think is worth replanting. Go get a 1 gallon perennial and you'll get a lot of bang for your buck all summer with this plant. But if you are like in South Fort Worth and you've got a really protected spot, I'm sure it will come back for you. Up here in Grapevine can be a little iffy, and farther north, I would think it'd be a little iffy. All right, Katie's Ruellia, which is a dwarf Mexican petunia. I do love this plant. I just think that it has a lot of uses for those little tiny spots at the edge of the border where you need to tuck something in. Or this picture here was taken at my church garden below a retaining wall, and there was a little space between the retaining wall and the sidewalk. So you need a plant that stays very small, that doesn't grow out over the sidewalk. So this was the plant that we used, and it can handle a lot of water or it can handle dry. So it's just blooms in the hottest part of the summer. In August is when this plant is really, really happy. I don't particularly care for the taller version of this, the regular Mexican petunia. I think it's extremely invasive. But if you know that going in, it has the same kind of bloom on it, but it will be on a plant that grows about 3 feet tall. So just know that it spreads from roots and popping seeds. And the low version here does pop seeds as well, but when you pull them out, it's gone. On the bigger version, the roots just entwine with everything. And if you leave a speck of root behind, it will take over again. So I'm just cautioning you on the big one, on the tall version of this. But Katie's Ruellia also comes in pink or white. I think the pink is called Bonita's Ruellia. I don't know what the white one's called, but anyway, there's a couple or 3 different colors of it. Sedums, lots of different varieties of sedums. Notice again that gray foliage, it likes dry. If this gets too much water, I have a client that had this growing near a creek bed, along the edge of the creek bed, or a downspout creek bed. Remember I showed you last week how I have the downspout come off the house and then it runs through cobble. So this was growing along the edge of that rock area, which is usually hot and dry. But with all of the rain that we had this year, it rotted the sedum. So make sure you put it where it's getting good drainage. There's, again, you can see the list there of all the different varieties. Just make sure you're getting a variety that is cold hardy. Some varieties of sedum, like Kamchaticum, is deciduous, so it goes dormant in the winter and comes back every spring. But the variety like Reflexum and Potacinum, those are evergreen. So they will, and Coral Reef, that as well is evergreen. So just depends on whether you want evergreen or don't mind the deciduous. But I just love them planted around rocks because they're creepy crawly. They're not invasive in the least. They are roots so shallowly. So if you want to get rid of them, they're really easy to pull up. And you can actually just break off a chunk and stick it in the ground and it will root. So you don't even need to dig up roots to transplant this. They're just great plants. All right, hardy hibiscus. Texas star hibiscus is one of those perennials that I said would grow 6 feet tall. They do like a little bit of extra moisture. So if you've got a spot in your garden that maybe the sprinkler system hits a little bit more, or the drainage is not quite as good as you would need for a salvia, maybe try a hardy hibiscus. Now they do go dormant in the winter, so you will cut, they grow on very thick stems, and those stems, will die down to the ground, and you cut it off at the ground. It does take until probably May for it to come back, so don't give up on it. It will come back. It's just a late comer, and then it will get like that variety Flare. It will have 6-inch blooms on it. I mean, they're enormous, dinner plate size blooms. There's another variety called Muy Grande. There's a Luna series of hardy hibiscus, so lots of varieties of that. There's a white Texas star hibiscus as well, so check those out. Okay, Morton's pink loosestrife or Lithrum. Now, if you grew up north, you know Lithrum as an invasive plant that grows in the swamps. Morton's pink is a sterile variety of loosestrife, so it does not set seed. It is not invasive in the least, but it does like a little bit more moist area. So I have mine growing next to King Humbert canna. So the two of them look great together and grow in the same conditions. So it'll grow about, 3 feet tall or so and get these nice pink spiky blooms on it that the pollinators love. Speaking of canna, I prefer canna that has interesting foliage. So my 2 favorite are King Humbert and Bengal Tiger. I just, if they never bloomed, I wouldn't care because I think the foliage is so interesting. And remember last week we were talking about contrasting textures. I love to place these bold textures in my garden because the smaller, finer textured perennials play off of those large leaves so beautifully. So in the picture with the Bengal Tiger, that's Salvia greggii in front of it. So that's a very fine textured plant and it just looks awesome with the bold texture of the Bengal Tiger behind it. So butterfly bush or Buddleia. There's lots of varieties of this. There's some newer ones out called Pugster, and they're much smaller, but there are some butterfly bush that will grow, oh my goodness, 5 or 6 feet tall. So just know the variety that you're getting. They do attract pollinators and butterflies. They're very fragrant. I do find that they require a lot of deadheading to keep them blooming. So put it in a place where you don't mind going out and snipping so that you can keep those blooms coming. There's blues and this lavender, there's pinks, and then the white. Jerusalem sage is notice that gray foliage, again, extremely drought tolerant. There's a couple different varieties, Roselliana or Fruticosa. Fruticosa has a more narrow leaf to it, but it grows in what's called a whorl of blooms. So you'll have a bloom and then it'll come up on the stem and it'll bloom again. It'll come up on the stem and bloom again. So it's just a really cool plant. I say that it's like lamb's ear, if you're familiar with lamb's ear, on steroids, because it grows, it's got the gray fuzzy leaves like a lamb's ear, but it will grow 4 feet tall and wide. So it will bloom in the May, June time frame, and then sporadically throughout the summer, but its main time is the May, June time frame. So it's a really, really cool plant. All right, Russian sage. Again, it needs excellent drainage and full sun. If you try to put this in too much shade or give it too much water, it's going to be floppy and very unhappy. So make sure it gets those conditions. Again, that gray foliage loves hot and dry. Gara, this doesn't have gray foliage, but it does like hot and dry. The common name is whirling butterflies, because the blooms themselves look like a little butterfly, and then when the wind blows, it looks like they're kind of bouncing around. So there's a pink variety of this as well. It'll grow about 2.5 to 3 feet tall. It's taller than it is wide. So it's very upright and just kind of moves with the wind. That's butterfly bush in the background there. Okay, red yucca. I guess I could put this actually in the shrub category too, because the foliage is evergreen and kind of almost the size of a shrub. The foliage will grow 2 to 2.5 feet tall, and this plant at maturity will be all of 4 feet wide. And then it gets these, it's not a yucca, it's in the aloe family, Hesperaloe. But then there's lots of new varieties of this. There's a yellow blooming variety. There's a deep red and a dwarf variety called Break Lights. This here is just your plain Jane, kind of a coral colored red yucca, but it will bloom. The bloom spikes it's blooming now. It will bloom, in the summertime. And then when the spikes are done, you just cut those to the ground, but you leave the foliage alone. The foliage is never pruned. I saw that the other day that they trimmed it like a hedge. I thought, oh my goodness. But I always say this is the closest plant to furniture that you're going to get in your garden. It needs almost nothing for maintenance other than cutting those bloom spikes off when they're done blooming once a year. Other than that, you have to do nothing to this plant. Just give it plenty of sun and not too much water. It will be very happy. I'm not a huge fan of the regular yucca because it's so pokey, and it's hard to do maintenance around it because it's so pokey. But this plant here doesn't have such sharp ends to it, and it's just super, super easy maintenance. Okay, Zexmania, native, excellent drought tolerant perennial that will bloom its head off with these yellow little daisy-like blooms all summer long. Put it in a hot, dry place. Although on some websites you're going to see that it can handle some shade. I do find that it works much better in sun. So if you put it in shade, expect it not to bloom as much, and it'll be a little bit looser on its form. It'll grow about 4 feet wide and 1.5 feet tall. Rock rose is extremely, again, drought tolerant, heat loving. I have found if it gets too much water and it gets too much shade, it's going to get powdery mildew badly. So make sure it gets full blasting sun. There's a white variety called Brazilian rock rose. They will grow about 3 feet tall and wide. So give it space. All right, lantana, there's lots of lantanas are technically considered an annual, some of the new hybrids, but this lantana camera and lantana horrida are native and very large. They will grow upwards of 4 to 5 feet tall and wide. So give it room. Huge plant, but a pollinator attractor like crazy will attract the butterflies. I think we're all familiar with lantana. Verbena bonariensis is a tall verbena. It's got, very rigid stems, and it will stand at least 4 feet tall, but it's very airy, so it stands up above your perennials and just kind of blows in the breeze. And I just love this plant. Again, extremely drought tolerant. Don't give it too much water. Flame acanthus. This is another very large perennial that will grow about 4 feet tall and wide. You can cut it back in the wintertime. This is a hummingbird attractor because they love red tubular blooms. This is 4 feet tall and wide, very large. Again, give it plenty of sun, and a hummingbird attractor, if anybody didn't hear that. Okay, monarch magnets. Monarchs, they come through in the spring and the fall. We're on their migration in north central Texas here, and that's what a little egg deposit looks like. So if you see that on the back of a plant, you're going to know that's a monarch. This is the monarch larva eating its way on the milkweed, and that's the mature. So we can grow different kinds of milkweed here. There are native varieties. This is the tropical or the Mexican milkweed. It usually dies back in the wintertime. But it has the 3 different color blooms. And then this is the native Asclepias tuberosa. That's just the orange. So they need this. This is their larval source. They have to have milkweed to lay their eggs. They will visit lots of plants for nectar, but they have to have milkweed to reproduce. Okay, this is a monarch magnet as well. This is a little, I would consider invasive though, so make sure that you put it where, keep it in bounds, put it that way. The Greggii variety is not, it has a little more serrated leaves and maybe not quite as invasive, but the coelestinum I have found extremely fast growing. It'll form this mound though of these powdery blue blooms that will just bloom in the autumn. They bloom, and so maybe late September, October timeframe. But I'm telling you what, it will attract monarchs like crazy. Fall aster obviously blooms in the fall, very late blooming. My only complaint about this plant is it blooms very late in the fall, and I wish it bloomed longer because it is just a purple explosion when it does bloom in October timeframe. If you will cut this plant back in half by July, usually anything that blooms in the fall, if you'll cut it back by half in July, before July, you get stronger stems and more blooms. Same thing with Mexican marigold. This is also Texas tarragon. So if you like to cook with tarragon, this is a great substitute for that. I love to plant it with Mexican bush sage because remember on the color wheel, we talked about opposites attract. So you got the purple and the yellow, just always looks great together. Very fragrant foliage. I love to put this by a walkway where I can walk by and just touch the foliage because it smells like licorice. It just smells so good. Copper Canyon daisy. Some people don't like this plant because the foliage is very strong, lemony flavored, fragrance. But it blooms very late in the year, like November time frame, and then it has these little yellow daisy-like blooms on it. If I wanted a yellow blooming plant, I would probably go with Zexmenia over Copper Canyon. But if you've got a large garden and you want something blooming its head off in November timeframe, then this is a great plant. But it grows very large, all of 4 feet wide and probably 2 feet tall. I am probably going to need to really hurry along here because I've got a lot more to go. We have to get through shade. Here's another kind of sedum called Autumn Joy. This one here, again, gray foliage, needs excellent drainage. If you give it too much, it's just going to rot. My tip on this is if when it gets about 8 inches tall, if you'll cut it back by half, it'll branch out better. I have found that it gets, if I let it get too tall, then it just kind of flops. Garlic chives. I always know that I've survived another Texas summer when the garlic chives start blooming because they start blooming in September when the temps start cooling, and they will attract bees like crazy. My tip on this plant though is when it starts forming seed heads, cut those off because when it reseeds, it will reseed everywhere. So you just want to enjoy the blooms. And use this in your cooking. Oh my goodness, those blooms. If you eat a little fresh bloom, it is the most spicy, garlic, wonderful flavor. So mums, everybody's familiar with chrysanthemums. Lots of varieties, lots of heights, lots of colors. Blooms in the fall. And they actually bloom in the springtime too. And if you keep pinching them, they get thicker to support the fall blooms. Again, here's that gray foliage, so we know what that means, hot and dry. This is at a client of mine here in Grapevine, and that little corner garden right there, it gets no irrigation. So we're growing yucca and purple heart and cacti and Mexican feathergrass and Powys Castle artemisia. It's evergreen, but it does need to be cut back. Believe it or not, this 4-foot wide perennial needs to be cut back to about 6 inches every February. If you don't, it gets very woody and rangy and looks very scraggly looking. So cut it back hard every February and you'll get nice new fresh foliage. And this is a performer in hot, dry areas. And, you know, mulch it with decomposed granite or gravel and it'll be even happier. This is lamb's ear. Remember I was talking about the Jerusalem sage looks like lamb's ear on steroids. So you can see the similarity with the foliage. I recommend this variety, Helen von Stein. It's the big ear lamb's ear. There's the old timey little ear lamb's ear that blooms, that purple bloom. I don't care for that variety. I think it's invasive and I really don't care for the bloom, but this variety, Helen von Stein, is much tidier and it doesn't bloom. If it does ever bloom, it is very rare. But this is just a much better behaved plant. It does need a little grooming a couple times a year. So you can just pull off any tattered foliage or any browning foliage, just clean it up and it'll just keep producing new leaves for you. It grows about, 6-8 inches tall and it'll form a mound about 1.5 to 2 feet wide. Purple heart, everybody knows purple heart, wandering Drew or Secretia, Trescantia, lots of names for this plant, but it is a producer and this is growing in my front garden along the sidewalk and with hot reflective but it can also handle a little bit of shade too. I don't think I would put it in full dense shade, but if it gets some shade, it's still happy. This is a variety here called Pale Puma that stays much smaller and tidier. So I love this variety. It doesn't get quite as dark purple as the old timey variety. But still does have that purplish cast to it. So great plants. And you just break off a stem, stick it in the ground, and it grows. All right, Alstroemeria. A lot of times in bouquets, you'll find, you know, like you get it from a florist, it's got Alstroemeria in it, and they last for a very long time in a vase. This Peruvian lily or parrots variety, I think, is one that I grow. And it's blooming right now. It can be a little aggressive after that. It gets that 3rd year, it really starts leaping. So you need to set boundaries for it. But I grow mine even in a little bit of shade. So this is a plant that can kind of handle both. Inca Ice is another variety that's got a little bit different bloom on it. Lilies, lots of different types of lilies. Agapanthus, the Triumphator, Black Beauty are these here. They have a very short bloom time, but you know, it's just fun to add that extra big pop of bloom. So candy lily, I don't know if you've ever heard of this variety. It has very iris-like foliage to it, but then it sends up these really sweet little orange blooms on it. And then when they twist, when the spent bloom has that twisted look to it. So it's really a cool plant. So if you find this plant, get it. It needs full sun. But I have it growing by my pond and I love it. It's not in the pond, but next to it. Okay, crinum lily. I think we all know crinum lilies. This is an old timey plant. You cannot kill a crinum lily. They have a really big bulb. If you ever need to transplant it or divide it, you better have a strong shovel and a strong back. Those bulbs will root down at minimum 1 foot to 1.5 feet in the ground, and it forms big strap-like foliage, and then it gets these trumpet-like blooms on it. So lots of different varieties of crinum. I'm sure everybody's got a friend who's got a crinum lily that can give them a start. Bulbs are great perennial plants for us. Grape hyacinth, the wisely blue starflower. These are all spring blooming bulbs. Leucojum or summer snowflake has a cute little white bell on it. They're planted in the fall and then they bloom in the spring. Daffodils, we're all familiar with daffodils. Again, planted in the fall, bloom in the spring. Put them in full sun, and then after the bloom, you have to let the foliage die down to the ground, or at least yellow for 6 to 8 weeks, so that it stores the energy for the next year's bloom. We all wish we could grow tulips like that, but we can't. That's Holland. This was a lady in Colleyville who used to plant 9,000 tulips in her garden, but you can grow species tulips. They're much smaller, not quite as a wow factor, but they are a perennial tulip in our area. These are a couple spring blooming bulbs for our area: Byzantine glad and gladiolus, and then amaryllis, the hardy amaryllis. So they will return every year. On the glad, again, like a daffodil, you have to let that foliage die back, and then it'll come back the following year. Rain lilies, they're a lot of fun too. They will bloom after a rain. They have grass-like foliage, and then they send up these blooms. There's a yellow blooming variety as well. These are some fall blooming bulbs. Oxblood lily. Again, I know I've survived another Texas summer when the oxblood lilies start blooming. Very sweet little 6-inch, red little tubular blooms, and they bloom about September timeframe when the kids are going back to school. So that's a fun one to add to your garden. It doesn't bloom for a very long time, but it's just a fun addition to your fall blooming bulbs. Again, this is another fall bloomer. This is Lycoris radiata, or red spider lily. There's a pink variety called Lycoris squamigera. So it has strap-like foliage. It blooms first, and then it sends up the foliage after that. This is an autumn crocus, or a Sternbergia lutea, and it will bloom again in the fall with these crocus-like yellow blooms. I know Neil Sperry always talks about this being his favorite fall blooming bulb. Wildflowers, they bloom in the spring. They're annual, but they reseed. So these are reseeding annual wildflowers. The poppies, larkspur, I plant them from seed, and they just keep reseeding in my garden. So they're fun to give you that early spring bloom. Just a close up of those poppy blooms. Then you let the blooms go to seed on these, and let them completely dry and go through that ugly period. And then you can collect the seeds and scatter them back in your garden or share them with friends. So just to finish up the sun section, we're going to talk about a few annuals, just very few annuals. There's so many, but these are ones that really can beat the heat. The profusion, or the Zahara zinnias, are great. Gomphrena is great, and Melampodium. All of these annuals love the heat. These are some annuals, my favorite annuals for a part sun situation. So morning sun, afternoon shade possibly, or vice versa. I wouldn't put them in all day blasting sun. So pentas, well, the periwinkles, I take that back. They can take and actually need all day sun, but can handle part sun as well. These are periwinkles growing in my health strip there in August. So periwinkles can succumb in these wet years to phytophthora, which is a soil-borne fungal problem. So make sure you plant these after we quit having those spring rains, and make sure you mulch so that the soil doesn't wash up on the leaves, because it will bring that fungal problem overnight, and they will die overnight, and they're going to start yellowing and wilting, and you're thinking, oh, they're dying, I need to water them more, and you're just killing them faster. So all right, now let's move into shade real quickly here. Hostas, everybody knows hostas. I don't really recommend them for this area. The slugs and the snails just chew them to smithereens. I grow hostas in pots, and they seem to do better for me. So if you've struggled with hostas, and maybe you've had great success with them in the ground, but if you haven't, try them in pots and see if it doesn't work a little bit better. You can treat them with a product called Bonide's bug and slug killer, or Sluggo. It's a granular product that will help deter the slugs and the snails from chewing them to smithereens. But instead of hostas, I grow leopard plant. It has this beautiful glossy foliage, and then it blooms in November with these yellow daisy-like blooms. There's variegated varieties. They all have that kind of octagon looking, shape to their leaf. But just excellent, excellent shade plant for our area. This is a giant leopard plant, and the leaves are giant. This is a picture at the Dallas Arboretum. So if you want to see that plant planted in mass, it's just gorgeous over there. Now, when the blooms go to seed, they look like these little puffballs. So what I do is I collect those seeds, after they're completely dried, and I scatter them around in my garden, and I get seedling leopard plants all the time. And this year I potted them up I took and scattered the seeds in a flat of several flats, and they all germinated. So I'm hoping I can get these plants to clients this year, because they can be a little bit hard to find, but I know Steagles in Fort Worth sells them all the time. I plant African hosta or Dremeopsis maculata instead of regular hostas. This is a great hosta for our area. It's not a true hosta, but it's perennial. It does go dormant in the winter, but then it comes back faithfully every spring. It's more of a bulb, and does not like too much water, so it can rot if it's planted too deeply and it's getting too wet, but it needs shade. Wood fern, everybody knows ferns. This is a deciduous fern. It will die back or go dormant in the wintertime. So after that first freeze, you're gonna have just a bunch of brown foliage. Just cut it to the ground. It'll come back in the spring faithfully. It's just a very nice soft green color. This is holly fern. It's an evergreen fern. Now I do realize this year it had a lot of freeze damage to it, but it just cut it to the ground if it has a lot of freeze damage, and it should come back. Some of them are struggling to come back this year, but that is a rare problem. It usually comes back faithfully every year. If on the back side of the leaves you see these spots, don't worry, that's not a disease, it's not an insect. Those are baby ferns in the making. They're spores that you will see on the backs of those leaves. Nothing to worry about. We just don't have the right moist conditions long enough for holly ferns to germinate in our soils. So you have to go, you have special conditions for that. But when you see those, don't worry. Japanese painted fern, just really colorful foliage. Even though it's gray foliage, they still need shade and water. Very low growing. This is autumn fern. It's another evergreen fern that the new growth has that kind of coppery look to it. So it's more of those autumn colors on the new growth, but then they turn to green. But it's evergreen. It'll grow about 2 feet tall and wide. Cast iron plant. Now this did take a hit in the freeze, but I just cut it all back and it's coming back now. But it's very broad foliage. There's solid green varieties, and then I grow a variegated variety. So the variegated is not commonly available, but if you find it, get it, because it's really adds just a little extra interest in your shade garden. But it'll grow about 2 to 2.5 feet tall, and then just has those big broad leaves. And so if you plant that near like the wood fern, that's got that really fine texture, you're playing off those textures again. So this is Bear's Breeches, or Acanthus mollis. It has these big acanthus leaves, and then it will send up these bloom spikes in May, June timeframe. So they're really cool looking. This is a very large plant though. It will grow, at least 3 feet wide, maybe 4 feet wide. The foliage itself only grows about 2 feet tall, but then those bloom spikes will come up probably 4 feet tall. So if you can give this a little morning sun, it will do better for you, but definitely afternoon shade. Coral bells, or heuchera or heucherella, I have found that these do better for me in pots as well. They need excellent drainage. So if you've got sandier soil and you can put them where they get excellent drainage, they will do better for you. But if you've struggled with them in a pot, try them in, if you struggle with them in the ground, try them in a pot. Look for varieties that have like a Southern name in them, Alabama or Southern Comfort. They were bred to handle our heat a little bit better. They tend to be a little bit happier up north. Okay, elephant ears, there's colocasia, and the leaves on colocasia droop down, and the leaves on alocasia stand up. So I have this variety called California alocasia. So it did suffer some freeze damage, but it's coming back. It's a dwarf elephant ear, but it will grow about 3 feet tall, form a clump 3 to 4 feet wide. And I've had that plant for over 15 years, and it's handled everything that, our winters have ever dished out. It has gone dormant, and some years it stays evergreen. But this year it got hit really bad with that freeze, even in a protected area, but it is coming back. So I'm glad to see that. Japanese Aurelia or Fatsia. This is an evergreen. If you ever get up to Garvin Woodland Gardens in Arkansas, they've got a huge display of it. It's beautiful. But it gets these really cool white puffball blooms on it in December, January timeframe. This too, put it in a protected space in your shade garden. It can sustain major freeze damage. I lost probably 3/4 of mine this year. So on really, really cold years, it can have some damage. So put it in a protected space, but it is coming back quite vigorously. So it should recover, but just know that I wouldn't plant a whole garden of this because, you could lose it, but a few plants here and there, just knowing you might have to protect it. Violet, wood violet. Do not plant wood violet, plant sweet violet. Wood violet is extremely invasive. It will set seeds and send roots everywhere, but sweet violet is much, much, much better behaved. So make sure you get the right variety on that. Gets these cute little purple blooms on it, very early spring, but it's an evergreen, so the foliage stays there all winter. Ground orchid, Chinese ground orchid. Again, this needs very good drainage, but it's a great little shade plant. Gets these cute little orchid, purple orchid-like blooms on it, and that grassy strap-like foliage. Oxalis, lots of different varieties of oxalis, but I grow that purple Oxalis triangularis like crazy in my garden. There's the pink and then the white as well. So I just have this growing all over in my shade garden. It does very well. If you ever get some rust colored spots on the backs of the leaves, it's a fungus called rust fungus. All I do is I grab the leaves and the stems and I rip them off because the little tiny corms will stay in the ground. Just rip all the foliage off, throw that away, don't throw it back on the ground, and then mulch the area again, and then it will regrow and be clean. It's just when we have a wet spring and the fungus problem can take a hold. Columbine, Texas Gold Columbine is a native, Texas native. There's also a red variety for the shade garden. Gets these really cool blooms on it with the little spikes sticking off the back side of them. It'll grow about 2 to 3 feet tall or so, and it'll bloom from March into April, and then it kind of goes dormant in the summer. So what I do is after it's done blooming and the foliage starts looking crummy, I cut it to the ground, and then when it cools down again in the fall, it'll send up new foliage again, and that foliage will be evergreen. It's not an overly long-lived perennial, but if you collect the seeds and scatter them back in, then you can get baby seedlings coming up when the mature plant has faded away after a few years, and you can get some seedlings from it. Variegated Solomon seal can be, again, a little difficult to find, but if you find this plant, it's a fun one to add to your shade garden. It gets tiny little white bell-shaped blooms on it in early spring, and I just like anything variegated I like in the shade because it just brightens up an area. This is chocolate plant. This is a cool plant. Again, Steagles in Fort Worth sells this plant. It's just really got a cool foliage. It does come back late. It goes dormant in the wintertime after it freezes, but then about May timeframe, it starts coming back. And if you will collect the seeds from this, you can scatter it around and get seedlings coming up, but it gets that really cool chocolate colored foliage with that silvery stripe down the middle of it. And then it gets these pretty little violet blooms on it that stand up maybe a foot above the plant. Really cool plant. So if you find it, get it. Neat plant. It can handle all of morning sun. It's best if you can give it afternoon shade. Turk's cap is a native in our area, and it can handle full blasting sun or shade. I probably wouldn't put it in really, really dense shade, but anything in between full sun and part shade. It's a hummingbird attractor like none other. Blooms its head off, and very large though. My tip on this plant is after it is done, or after it freezes and the foliage falls off, and you see the long stems that have laid on the ground and rooted in, grab those stems and rip them back to the main plant and cut them off. And that way you will keep it from spreading and taking over, because each of those stems, as they lay on the ground, will root in, and it's a very tough, strong rooting plant. So if you let it keep rooting, it will keep taking over. But it's very easy to maintain. I mean, just rip those rooted stems out, cut it back to the main plant, and you'll keep it much more contained. Tropical giant spider lily, Hymenacalis. We talked about the red spider lily before. This is a totally different animal. It's tropical in name only. It's very hardy. It gets this beautiful strap-like foliage, and then it blooms those really cool white blooms around the 4th of July. Lots of my clients are sending me their pictures of their spider lily right now, and they're blooming right now. So they're a little early this year, but usually around July 4th is when they're blooming. It can handle full sun. I wouldn't put this in dense shade, but it can handle a lot of shade or full sun or anything in between. Really cool plant, but it will grow about 3 feet tall and wide. I like this much better than crinum lily because the foliage looks good. If it never bloomed, I wouldn't care. Crinum lily will come up, the foliage will come up, and then it'll kind of split and fall down, whereas the tropical giant spider lily foliage stays great looking throughout the whole growing season. It does die back down to the ground in the wintertime, but it comes back faithfully. American beautyberry probably could even be in the shrub category for next week, but it will grow. I have a client who has one of these that's 8 feet tall and wide. I cut mine back every year down to about 18 inches to keep it in that. It'll grow up then to be about 4 foot tall and wide. So I like mine to stay a little bit smaller, but it gets these purple berries on it. There's a white blue berry variety as well, native, and the birds love the berries, and the berries come in the fall. Black and blue salvia it's a salvia that can handle a lot of shade. It does spread quite readily though, so know that going in. You may have to keep that in bounds. But it's going to grow about 4 feet tall or so, and it gets, it's called black and blue because the calyx that holds the blue bloom, the calyx is black and the bloom is blue. There are some purple varieties of this. There are some with a green calyx and a blue bloom. So just if you want the black and blue, make sure you get that variety specifically. This is another kind of sage that will bloom in the shade. It's called Salvia madrensis or Forsythia sage. Forsythia is a yellow blooming spring blooming shrub that we'll talk about next week, but that's how it gets its name, because it's got these big yellow blooms on it. And really, really deep green foliage. A very large plant though, all of 4 feet tall and wide. Hellebores or Lenten rose, they will bloom in January, February timeframe. So if you want something blooming in your shade garden in the wintertime, this is an awesome plant. I love this variety called Molly's White. It's in the Frost Kiss line. There's other varieties in this line like Penny's Pink and Deborah's Dawn or something like that, but Molly's White, they all have that variegated foliage. So even when it's not blooming, it's a really good looking plant. But here's a close-up of some of the other blooms. Some of the newer varieties are bred so that the blooms stand up, because a lot of hellebores have the blooms that hang down, and it's a very low growing plant. So it only grows about 1 foot tall. So when the blooms are hanging down, you almost have to get on the ground to appreciate them. But the way I appreciate these blooms is I cut them and in the wintertime, and I float them in a bowl of water, and they will last for a good week, in the house. So in the wintertime, if you're not wanting to be outside, you can enjoy those blooms inside. Really cool plant for shade. Carex is a new one on the scene here. These Everillo and Evergold, there's a few other varieties of it, but they are a grass for shade. So they grow about 18 inches tall and wide. I love this variegated foliage again in the shade garden because it's so bright. Bulbs for shade. Spanish bluebells do well in understory conditions underneath big shade trees. preferably a deciduous shade tree, like I grow them underneath my red oak and my elm. And I like to grow them in with columbine because they bloom about the same time. So you get the yellow and the blue blooming at the same time. Just finishing up here real quickly, just a couple annuals that I like for shade. Pretty much no fail. Caladiums and dragonwing begonias. If you can do them in the ground, you can do them in containers. If you need a great container plant for shade, these two together are it. And then just again, here's those websites. I showed them last week, but if you have any questions about perennials, when you Google it, you will follow that up with TAMU, you will get Texas A&M research information on that perennial, and yeah, do your research on that. But then you can see the other websites listed there. So is it the end or is it just the beginning? So I hope you're inspired again to plant some perennials. I always say a day without dirt under your nails is like a day without sunshine. So I hope you, maybe not this summer, but this fall, get out there and plant some perennials. Do your planning this summer so you can do your planting this fall. And fall is the best time to do the planting because our soils don't freeze usually, and that way the roots can be establishing and they're ready to go by the following summer. So again, I pointed these out last week, but just if you want some information on my blog site, I've got lots of information on there about my perennials. I have my summer newsletter is up right now, and then also on Instagram and Facebook if you want to follow me there. And I guess that's it. So